The more information you have, the more time you spend seeing through somebody else's mind, whether it's an emperor from 2,000 years ago, then coming back to yours, you can try to see what's necessary from what's not.
Well, I loved your book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's nice of you to say. I always especially appreciate it when a fellow Westerner, enjoys.
Where are you from?
I'm Los Gatos, but my family's from Sacramento.
Oh, really?
The Italians, yeah. We're all from the other side of the river.
Where in Sacramento?
So my mom says where my grandfather's or great-grandfather's house was. I think it was the other side of the. So I'm writing about Joan Didion now. It's the other side of the tracks of her house, and I got to go back and figure out like east, west, and all that. But that's. I lived there a little bit as a child too. Before coming back to the San Jose area where my family is now.
You want some Joan Didion trivia?
Yes.
This is her table.
Did you get it in the?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. Where do you think it was at the Franklin Avenue house, or do you think because she took everything everywhere? She took her piano.
Yeah.
Like all those places. This is beautiful.
Yeah, you got to get that cup off that.
You're exactly right. She would tell me to do that.
No, there's a coaster if you want it. No, I got the table, and I've seen pictures of a different dining room table that these chairs are at.
Oh, wow.
But I've never seen a picture of her at the table, so I don't know where it was in her house.
She always took that furniture. She went to Brentwood after Malibu, and Malibu was after Franklin Avenue.
Right. And then I have her chair, like it was like a writing chair, and I had that. That's what I sit at every day.
That's amazing.
You want to see it when we go?
I do, definitely. Yes. Yes.
I desperately wanted the desk, which was like a piece of Sacramento history. Also, it was like from her family. But $60,000 seemed like a lot of money for a desk. A lot of money for a desk.
I agree with you on that end.
I think my wife would have killed me, and so would the bank.
Right.
I'm as a Sacramentoan, I weirdly didn't have a relationship with Joan Didion. Like, I don't think I knew she was from Sacramento until. I mean, I guess I vaguely understood it in some of the books, but at no point growing up in Sacramento was it ever discussed that one of the greatest writers of the 20th century was from that town.
You're exactly right. It wasn't until, even the 2010s where she finally began to be identified in kind of a proud way.
Yeah.
Like before that, she was derogatory about and protective of it. But in the city, with Thompson, they've done the same thing. It was later when the city began to celebrate her, like how Louisville began to celebrate him. But you're right. I knew her, but I always identified her with Los Angeles.
Interesting. Yeah, and then the other writer that I'm slightly more fanboyish about than Didion is John Fante.
I just read Brotherhood of the Grape.
Oh, really? Because it's about Roseville. Yeah, his wife's family was from Roseville.
I've never seen another writer capture the Northern Italian experience, the Northern Italian immigrant experience, better than him.
Have you read any of the other ones?
No, I'm going to read In the Dust.
Ask the Dust. I have that in the story.
Yeah, I saw that.
One of the great novels of all time. Crazy story, which we should talk about. But he has a bunch. It's maybe 1933 was a bad year. The Road to Los Angeles. He has a couple books about his journey. He's seen as an LA writer, but he's from Colorado.
Yeah.
And so it's just it's such an interesting snapshot to American. You have the Italian-American experience, Colorado to LA, then Northern California. But as someone who loved books, I just think, what would it have done to me earlier to know that there were people who did this in the place that I was from? Sacramento is not a literary or artistic city in its own self-reckoning. So that it wasn't until I went to UC Riverside, it wasn't until I got to Riverside that I met Susan Straight, the novelist, and she was the first professor I met on campus because she taught this honors seminar that we had to take in the summer before we started.
Oh, cool. And
they assigned us to read her book. And I was like, a person wrote this. Like,
from where I'm from.
Yeah, but I wasn't. No, I'm like, a person wrote this about the place that they're from, and that place is not New York or Paris or London. Yeah. This is a writer writing about an off the map place, Riverside, Inland Empire, and is doing it at a high level, and then this is her job. And that, like, all these light bulbs went off for me.
Yeah. I love it. William Saroyan.
Yeah.
Saroyan wrote about the Central Valley. Like, when I read him, I was living in Honolulu, I was like, you can write about the Bay Area. Not the San Francisco or the, LA type noir story, but just about where we're from and the physicality of it.
Yes. And that thing can shape you. And if it's interesting to you, you can make it interesting to the reader, listener, whatever. Fante, I'll tell you about Ask the Dust. So Fante, I did this piece about this a couple of years ago, but so Fante, he writes Ask the Dust. It's supposed to be his breakthrough novel. And he publishes it with this small publisher called Stackpole and Sons. Comes out like 33, something like that. Anyways, is it 33? I forget what year it comes out. Maybe later. Maybe it's like 38. I think it's 38. And that same year, Stackpole, which was also, it was more of a military publisher. They did a lot of books of military history. They published an unauthorized edition of Mein Kampf.
Oh, wow.
Hitler being then, like, it'd be like if Putin had written a book and they felt like people should read it. Yeah. And they also felt like, fuck Putin, no royalties for you. Yeah. So they translated it in English and it's not an authorized edition.
Oh, wow.
HMH, Houghton Mifflin, still a publisher today, had the American rights. They and Hitler's literary agency and Hitler himself sue Stackpole and Sons and win in federal court, enforcing like a murderous dictator's copyright in America.
Oh my God.
The legend, it's true and not true, but the legend is Ask the Dust sells out its first printing, or is selling through its first printing at a good clip. It would have been a huge book. This distracts the publisher, sucks up its marketing budget, which they spend on legal fees, which they then lose. And Ask the Dust is then forgotten until 1970 whatever, when Charles Bukowski discovers the lone surviving copy in the Los Angeles Public Library.
Wow. I didn't know that story.
It's incredible. The book is so good.
Is that what you would recommend for someone who'd read Brotherhood of the Grape and is looking for something to read by Fante?
I think so. It's definitely his magnum opus. His short stories are good. He wrote this book, Full of Life, which was his most popular book. It wasn't a popular book, but it gets turned into a big movie that basically pays for everything. So basically what happens is once Ask the Dusk is destroyed, he's sort of heartbroken and then just becomes a well-paid but little-known screenwriter. He has a nice house in Malibu, paid for by movies that were never made, and was a frustrated novelist and sort of a drunk and a tortured dude as a result of this experience. He wrote one more Bandini novel before Ask the Dust. I'm forgetting what it's called. I've read all of them. And then after, and this is way nerdier than people probably want to listen to, but after Bukowski rediscovers Ask the Dust, as Fante is dying of diabetes, they're like chopping off his limbs
in
as
the
he's
hospital.
blind. He dictates to his wife the sequel, Dreams from Bunker Hill.
How's that? Because that's done. It's not done written out. He told his wife the novel while he was in the hospital.
It's really good. It's really good. I think you would like 1933 was a bad year because it's about Fante as a kid. It's the youth Italian American experience. But Ask the Dust is fascinating in that. So basically, the premise of Ask the Dust is Arturo Bandini, a delusional, narcissistic, aspiring writer who you can't help but relate to as a writer, falls in love with this Mexican girl who works at a diner in Bunker Hill.
Wow.
And she's racist towards him and he's racist towards her. And you don't think of, the American racism experience is primarily a black-white story as we understand it, I feel like. And then so to see two characters get it from two angles that are less discussed, and then the interplay between each other is fascinating.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, because he has this self-hatred, and she has this self-hatred, and then they're in this sort of abusive, toxic relationship, which is sort of metaphorical for the toxic relationship that every aspiring artist has with Los Angeles.
And I don't think I understood how colorism worked within like the Italian immigrant community too, where the one generation earlier, darker Italians, and you're ashamed of that, the one generation next. And I think we map on our own kind of, general American experience.
Yes.
A lot of that gets lost. So that sounds fascinating that it was interplayed out between both of them.
Every day I send out one Stoic-inspired email to hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. If you want more Stoic wisdom in your inbox, you can sign up at dailystoic.com/email. It's totally free. You can unsubscribe at any time. We'd love to have you. dailystoic.com/email.
Well, there's also, I think this is in Brotherhood of the Grape, there's a New World, Old World in it, which I saw. My grandfather was an immigrant from Yugoslavia, and my grandmother was from Germany. And so, but she sort of assimilated, and he was more like, making wine in his basement kind of a guy. And you know what I mean? And like, I could see how it played out for like, I've talked about this before, but my mom doesn't identify as anything but an American because she's white and, was born here. Whereas for him, he was an immigrant, right? And so I think in Fante, to have parents from Italy came, his parents would have been born probably in the 1800s to come to America. Like there's this, Fante loves baseball. He's like, and so obviously in the Black American experience, it's different because you're stamped with this thing. Passing is so much harder. And so these are all themes that I of course missed when I read Ask the Dusk at like 20, but now I think about quite a bit.
Yeah, but they're also so integral to things I missed growing up in California that are integral to the way I kind of look at it now and understand as tensions, that when you're a kid, you sense something maybe a little off, or people may be struggling or angry or resentful within different communities, within different cities. But I think it's hard to even remember that post-war space, and even that in between the war space that like Fante wrote about, and that really defined LA and San Francisco, and we just kind of got trickled down, all these like years and generations later.
Well, my parents spent a lot of time in Sausalito when I was growing up. They had this little boat that we would go to, and so they would take us out and we would go to like Angel Island, and to like Ellis Island is a integral part of New York's understanding of itself and its identity, and thus America. The idea that there was an immigration hub on the west coast of the United States, totally lost. California doesn't see it. Like California feels like the end of the line, not like the beginning of the entry point into America.
Yeah, and the DiMaggio story, like they're all fishermen, they're all Northern Italians, and the climate's so similar in Northern California, and so their whole family migrated out there. My Denevi family too, kind of at the same time. And it's such a strange thing to be so far away from where they were, to still be trying to practice the same family skills, fishing, and within an environment that's similar but so radically different.
When I think Fante's father, and then the character in the book is like a bricklayer. He's a stonemason. So he's this old world stonemason technique that it's like, you and I would have seen those houses, that generation of people built. Yeah. And that's their sort of version of the American dream. The other one that I got is I write about Harvey Milk in the book I'm doing now. And I read this interesting biography of him. He spends a big time talking about why San Francisco was a gay hub. And I just thought it was like these things are just too generous. It just happened. Yeah. And he's talking about how actually it was to send boys to Europe or to send boys to the Pacific in World War II. They would take them from all over the country and then put them on trains and get them there. Mm-hmm. And then the ones who they realized were gay, the Navy did not allow onto the ships. Yeah. That this is basically like this is the refuge of discriminatory Navy policies. And you just, what? I didn't even think about that. And you realize how these little decisions start just the genesis of a community. Right. And then, blah, 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 blah. I ended up in Sacramento because there was a big Slovenian community in San Francisco. So my grandfather came over from Europe and lands on the East Coast and just makes his way towards his people. And, then somehow I end up in Sacramento. Like these,
Yeah.
and Didion, I mean, Didion ends up in Sacramento because of the fucking Donner Party.
I know.
So she would have been looking at us as the new people.
Yeah,
like
she did.
She was like a seventh generation or something.
Yeah, and I think she always was seeing out ahead of her in an interesting way. You know, my family would be looking up towards her, you know, would be on the other side of the tracks, would be trying to be more white after coming over as Italians. And she knew all the communities there, but she, I think from a young age, her gaze was outward, you know, toward New York, toward other places. And then, I mean, the Donner Party is such a horrific story. Yeah. What a creation myth for your family, that you're one of the ones that survived, like, you know, and all of that.
Well, and then by the time I grew up in Sacramento, I don't know about you, but like all the, as this happened in basically all the American cities, this is also what Dreams of Bunker Hill and Fante's writing about. Like, you don't think, when you think downtown Los Angeles, you don't think big Victorian mansions, which is what was Bunker Hill gets raised and it becomes these skyscrapers. And to think, like when I was a kid, the houses in the 40s or the 30s, like the blocks of houses that the people like Didion grew up in, that was all an abandoned downtown. Like that was not safe, not nice. Everyone who had money, the dream would be to move to the suburbs. Yes. And I grew up in a nice suburb of Sacramento, like, and that was like where the athletes lived, and like everyone was trying to get out. Whereas to Didion, the whole center of gravity would have been these areas that by the time these other generations are here, it's like you're not even getting the language of it and the symbolism of it, because the dream has moved from a big house downtown to a big track house in the suburbs.
Like Auburn or somewhere like that outside. Yeah. And we forget the way that the floods worked, as you know, on that town. To have that higher ground downtown, you know, meant that house would be there, you know, 30 or 40. And we don't realize 70 years why that survived the floods. It's the best real estate. And that's where they built that big Victorian mansion. Sure. You know, and now I was playing in an adult baseball tournament, recreational father-son tournament, actually with the Italians. And we played a Sacramento team. So I'm playing first base, and I was asking, you know, what's the flood situation like now? And he said, really, since 86, they haven't had, you know, or it's not happening in the same way. So the entire logic of the city, and when I think of a relic, I think of something that exists now, where its narrative no longer makes sense in the present.
Well, Sacramento's a weird town in the sense that it's a river town, but it's a river town from San Francisco. Like, you don't go, oh, the people went around South America, landed in San Francisco, and then took boats from San Francisco to Sacramento. None of that sentence makes any sense to people, you know, for the gold rush. Like that's when this was happening. So none of that makes any sense anymore. And so, growing up where it's not until I read Didion that I really understood Sacramento as a river place. Yes. My only memory of I have two. One was river rafting, you know, in the summer sometimes. But I remember a couple times in my childhood, a whale would swim up the American River, and you'd be like, what? That doesn't make sense. How could a whale get from the ocean to here, and then how could the river be deep? Because you were so disconnected from water. Like, I didn't live anywhere near there. That wasn't, you know, the purpose of that had gone. The only time I would see it would be like on TV when they were showing that bridge during a Kings game or something. You know what I mean? Like it's just the reason the city exists is no longer why the city exists.
Yes, but everything that represents that original reason continues in our present without the explanations that we might have understood, you know, 40, 50, 70 years ago.
So one more author, since you mentioned Auburn, Ambrose Bierce, who I thought a lot about as I was reading your book.
Oh, wow.
Ambrose Bierce being, I think, and Hunter S. Thompson, both being two authors that I think are proof of the idea that, what is it, like a cynic is a spurned idealist, you know? He lived in Auburn for a long time. And I didn't find that out until later. But he was a San Francisco guy. He moved to that when I think of Hunter S. Thompson, I was thinking of Ambrose Bierce, in that my understanding of Hunter S. Thompson is the wild partying Hunter S. Thompson. I didn't, until I read your book, get my sense of him as the sort of political idealist who basically has his heart broken over and over again, and then just decides, ironically, to do what he talks about in Fear and Loathing, which is making a beast of yourself to get rid of the pain of being a man.
Yeah. And I think that, again, probably with you too, we got the trickle-down effect of the 1960s growing up. Many of our teachers may have been at San Francisco State.
Yeah.
Or on the West Coast barricades during all of that University of California upheaval.
Sure.
Just the political upheaval of the 60s. And I hadn't understood him that way either.
Yeah.
So it took me a while to kind of get back into his writing when I was in my 20s and trying to be a writer myself.
Yeah.
And seeing just how diligent and careful he was, which is not what we think of when we hear him, into as a journalist. Like a lot of my students I teach writing will try to start at Hunter Thompson, and they have to understand he took 15 years as a serious journalist playing the game, learning how to do the investigative reporting and the, lead paragraph, general journalistic writing before he then responded against it and found his own form.
Yeah, it's like you watch Patrick Mahomes and you see him throwing these sideways passes and scrambling and doing, and you don't realize that's not him not learning the playbook. Exactly. That's him having learned the playbook and played in the system since he was a kid all the way up. And then there is this element of mastery where you get to throw it away and improvise and exist on instinct and intuition. And yeah, if you see Hunter S. Thompson or other writers as unorganized and stream of consciousness and undisciplined, you're missing all of the discipline and order that built them up into the point where they could either do that on purpose or be so talented that they could get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, creativity, I used to think it was the blank page and then to something, but it really is that response to a system, and seeing what other people don't when they look at that. And I mean, Mahomes coming from a baseball background, a lot of quarterbacks do, but how rare that he could implement that kind of off balance, response. And I love that show on Netflix because the creativity of the camera angle close to him, where you see the decision making. I mean, that reminds me when I think of writing creativity. Again, it's not going from nothing to something. It's looking at what already is there and trying to see what other people don't and create something new from that.
Yes, and that you have to have the core mastery of language and word choice and all the ingredients that then can come together in a new way. But yeah, you don't see Hunter S. Thompson as trying at all, and that is a sign of mastery, I think. But he was so good first, and he learned all the basics first, and then he threw away everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's hard to do too because it's a risk.
Sure,
he wasn't doing it. The artistic explanation can be like, well, I had to do this. I would have been in no other place. Like art is that expression of, not being able to conform to whatever. But with Thompson, he needed to make money as a journalist. And so he still, as someone using the first person, having political opinions, using a more hybridized space, using found information within his text, he was taking a risk. And at the time, there happened to be publications that found it thrilling, and he had a method to that madness, a careful method, but he may not have made the money he was trying to make and be able to support his family by choosing not to write the standard, objective, reportage story.
Yeah, and also there's a certain survivorship bias, right? These writers by their handful of big pieces, and you don't see, but they published, and it's there in the archives, just a bunch of boring articles about regular events in the news, right? And then ultimately, once they become so successful, they could stop doing those things.
Yeah, and keep them out of their collections when they put them together later.
Yeah, but it's like, Didion was writing like a weekly column for like Look magazine or whatever
Vogue,
it is. Yeah, and probably 85% of them are totally unremarkable, uninteresting, indistinguishable from the other crap that was being published by other people at that time. And then it's like, to go to your baseball metaphor, it's like there's a lot of misses, there's a lot of singles, and then you remember the person for a couple of key home runs or grand slams or, pinch big moments, but there's thousands of at-bats between those two things.
That's exactly right. And they often, I think of Didion and Thompson. I think of Thompson with Kentucky Derby is decadent and depraved, which is what began to set him apart in our kind of cultural conversation, one of the things. And then Didion with Slouching Towards Bethlehem, she had no idea if she'd gotten that right when she went for like a month to San Francisco, and she had the cinematic kind of narration, and then with those really beautiful essayistic parts that came in, like, you know, Cold Spring and San Francisco in 1967. Neither of them thought, like, I made it. Those are the pieces that are gonna, you know, suddenly rise to the top of the national conversation. They weren't sure. And both in a kind of fascinating way did. So even their big hits or home runs at the time, they weren't sure that they'd done them the way they hoped.
And it's also hard to separate how big they were in the moment, and they were big writers, and the fact that for the next 40 years, those books sold 50 to 150,000 copies or whatever it is, right? Like that new the nonfiction classics section at every bookstore. It's not that the books were ever the Da Vinci Code or some massive, you know, pop sensation. It was more just that they stuck around and they were rediscovered by generation after generation after generation, and that there's and actually it would take a while for it to really have the resonance that it did, because you don't see it as a coming of age classic until multiple generations have come of age to it.
Exactly. And I think they were both really good at looking how the media was talking about an event like hippies or Hell's Angels, and seeing when they saw that up close what was going on, how wrong the media narrative in Time or Life or Look was. And that lasts today in a really nice way, I think.
Yeah. You don't see them as contrarians, but effectively both Hell's Angels, incredible book, and Didion's couple books of essays there were really counter-programming, not weirdly, like counter-programming to popular culture, but there's also weirdly something conservative about them. Do you know what I mean? Like, Hunter S. Thompson is ultimately indicting the Hell's Angels. He's just understanding why they're popular.
Exactly.
And Didion is, it's like Didion's inner Sacramentoan is going like, these people don't know the answer.
There's a 5-year-old on acid. Like, somebody help these children.
Right. She's not going, oh, look at these hippies with their long hair. She's actually understanding them and dismissing and arguing against them and judging them for different reasons. But it's resonating. Ultimately, they're both indictments of American culture in that time.
And the promise. I mean, that's why even when I'm working on the Didion stuff now, reading her a lot, I'm always remembering, you know, it's in Fear and Loathing, Thompson's, it's the wave speech, but the failure of the 60s, where just that sense that your inevitable energy would prevail and that you'd win and that the movement would naturally reach its goals, but without the hard, you know, daily application, such change demands. And that the other side, the mean and militaristic forces, wouldn't, in their power and planning, defeat you and your idealism in that. And I think both saw the promise and the failures on a tactical level of the counterculture movement in the 1960s in a really clear manner.
I think about that Hunter S. Thompson speech all the time. For people who haven't read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, maybe you've seen the movie, you think it's this book about debauchery and partying and craziness, when really it's this sort of elegy and sad meditation on the failure of all the idealism of the 60s. He says, you look outside your hotel room in Las Vegas and you see the high watermark of the 1960s, you know, the death of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, both Kennedys. You see, and he's like, this is where it peaked, and now we're here in Las Vegas doing what we do. And so there's some irony that the book would become popular and people would be doing the Las Vegas version, not the... hey, change is really hard. Political organization is really hard. Good meets against implacable evil. And even if you win the cultural battle, if you don't mop up the other stuff, it doesn't stick. And he's making a beast of himself in sort of the depressing realization that the bad guys won.
Yeah. You know, and that I think we still see it today. I mean, many of them are gone, but so many of those key players when they were young then are still fighting the same battles in their 70s and 80s now. I mean, I for a long time thought it was a new conversation based on the 60s, many of our political arguments now. But the more I read about it, maybe I'm just getting older, the more I realize it's the same conversation we've really been having.
Yeah.
And it's depressing and heartening and scary, but we've really been fighting those same battles, you know. And what makes me crazy is when the younger generation now in their 20s or whatever don't really, through either a lack of reading or because TikTok can't capture it, again, I'm sounding very old, don't realize how that conversation has evolved but is still continuing.
Well, it's weird given those two books, which are laments of the failures of the 60s. Culturally, we took this lesson from those that change is brought about by organizing, marching, and writing music and art. And that's fundamentally not what the civil rights movement was or how it worked. And uniquely, the civil rights movement was centered around marching because marching was illegal.
Yes.
Right? They only got together in groups and marched because it was illegal. And then they would clash with the police. And the police would show how bankrupt their authority was. And the mask would slip. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, marching, for the most part, is not illegal anymore. Yeah. And so the idea that you just have to get a large group of people together and that will send a message to the people in power. You know, Kennedy was on the side of the civil rights march for the most part. And even he looks at the March on Washington and just sort of like, okay, that doesn't solve the legislative issue that we have. Yes. The civil rights movement worked because fundamentally it ultimately changed public opinion by the overreaction to the entrenched interest. But like, yeah, we took this message from it because ultimately they did prevail in the long run to a degree that like, hey, the way to bring about change is to change your profile picture on social media, to sign a petition, right, to call your representatives, which isn't it at all.
I agree. And I love when Thompson writes about the 60s and with protests, he said, you know, the powers that be, at first, they had to respond to it. It was illegal to march. Bull Connor, whether he wanted to or not, the police chief, he had to respond to that act. Yep. And he, as a person in power, could have his power at least undermined or even taken away from him. By the end of the 60s and the start of the 70s, Thompson writes about how Nixon doesn't care how many people march. He's like, you're marching. It's not going to change my position. And that terrifies Thompson because then he realizes, one, like in Chicago, you can just, which, you know, daily on the other side, you can just beat the shit out of the protesters.
Right.
Or two, you can't affect national change like that as a group anymore. Yes. It has to be more on the community or local level. Yeah. And for him, it was a shock because he believed that too. Enough people get together, enough people go in the right direction, you know, their energy will prevail. And by, you know, 68 into 72, his realization that, oh my God, they're insulated from that. The people in power, it doesn't matter. That's not going to work on them.
Well, also, I feel like you capture this well in the book. Hunter S. Thompson has this sort of big picture realization, and then he has this small picture realization of just running for local office. Yes. And he sees how rigged the system is, how hard it is to win, even though, like, I wouldn't vote for Hunter S. Thompson. He's a drug addict. He's a crazy person. But I think he gets this point. He, unlike a lot of cultural critics, artists, writers, organizers, has actual firsthand experience in how entrenched interests protect their power, protect themselves, push away potential disruptors, co-opt potential organizers or change agents. And so he has this sense of, oh, okay. So he understands what Nixon's doing at the local and the national level, and the Nixon-like figures are doing at this level. And so it really is kind of just astute understanding of what's happening, rooted in his understanding of history, psychology, local politics, whatever, that again is masked by the fact that he has this reputation of being a wild man badass, when there's really not just astute cultural commentary, but like very relevant and modern information that Black Lives Matter could use, or whatever your group is.
Yeah. And what I think is fascinating too is when it comes to a successful politician, you know, one of the skills is to be a good vote counter. And whether that's in the Senate, to know how many you have, whether that's when you're running for speaker, to know how many you have before you do it. Bobby Kennedy, when he was his brother's, like, you know, right-hand man, was a great vote counter, you know, at the nomination process. And Thompson and Aspen, when he was running for mayor, or he had his friends, you know, running for positions in the city council, He was an excellent vote counter, and he knew how many votes were out there.
Yeah.
He knew how many he needed to get. So he writes about it often comically. He often dramatizes his bewilderment so well.
Yeah.
But he's writing about that now at a desk, days, weeks, months later. And the him on the page, the him that's kind of a buffoon or acting or being excessive, that him was also the one that understood when to challenge and when to pull back, and how to move against, in Aspen, an elite, powerful group that wanted and eventually would succeed in, developing this gorgeous place just so they can make more and more and more money. Now the billionaires, my friends in Aspen say, replaced the millionaires.
Yes.
But back then, and he was another favorite writer of mine is James Salter.
I love James Salter.
And so he was an Aspen resident and worked with Thompson on that. I mean, he's a lot like Fante, where he spent a period of his life writing screenplays nobody made movies from, but made enough money off it. And he told me he regretted that more than anything, because a book is something that lasts. It's a technology.
Did you get to meet James Salter?
Yeah, I spent some time with him. It was really nice in 2014.
Yeah, he's another incredible novelist that I guess you wouldn't make anymore. He's sort of a figure of the 20th century where he's got this, he's one of the great fighter pilots, great fighter pilot. Not like he was in the army or in the air, but was an elite fighter pilot, like a Top Gun level fighter pilot.
Yes.
And so he has this kind of first love, which is that, and this second love, which is writing. And his novels are incredible.
That gets to mastery too. He shot down 2 MiGs in Korea.
Yeah.
He was a professional. He was a pilot. They would go, I always remember how he writes about going to Morocco to do target practice, where they'd trail this giant target and shoot with paint. Just the daily level of practice and skill it takes to not crash a jet or to be able to shoot another jet down. It is still mind-blowing. And he, in his writing, I think, communicates that beautifully. But he was also ended up in Aspen, and a completely different person than Thompson, was still trying to make the control your immediate surroundings in politics better, and worked with them.
Yeah, so I've gotten to know a number of fighter pilots because my books have sort of made their way through the military, and starting to get the sense that, a Navy SEAL, fighter pilot, author, actor, hedge fund trader, that these are all kind of these elite professions that are more the same than they are different. The level of mastery, self-control, sort of compulsion, the ambition required, that they're all speaking a language or on a wavelength that they understand. And sort of recognizes like. Do you know what I mean? Or a game recognizes game. So for Salter to move from the fighter pilot world to the writing world and sort of see them as this, I always love that about him.
Yeah, me too.
He's so great. Also not super appreciated. Kind of after his death was maybe rediscovered a little bit.
Yeah, like a writer's writer. But I think, again, we get one version of him. He's writing about sex. He's writing about New York. I think he wrote about fighter pilots, about flying better than anybody I've read. But he was also, right when Joan Didion was, living on Franklin Avenue, he was friends with Roman and Polanski and Sharon Tate. He would stay with them when he'd go to do treatments. He was part of that world too. And I think that gets lost also when we talk about him. He's a writer's writer. He taught at the workshop in Iowa. His sentences are beautiful, but I think for someone to last, it has to go beyond just that craft. He has to have been, I think he captured something that we're still trying to figure out about what post-war America was like. And it could be his white Jewish background and experience, but even beyond that, I think it was coming out of the Army, that shared sense of skill and mastery, and then falling out, and so many people in the 1960s not knowing where to go or what to do. He didn't want to be a businessman in that sense. He didn't want to live the life of many of the people that he saw around him, but he still struggled and wasn't sure.
Yeah, you get this sense he goes to West Point. It's this culture that he loves, this sort of discipline, order, structure, old world values, and the virtues. And then to leave the Army and be in the 60s, you're like, who are these people, right? What is this about? I think that's also what makes Tom Wolfe's writing so good. Is Tom Wolfe is clearly a character from the generation before, but then he's writing about Ken Kesey, and he's writing about they're a part of it, but they're apart from it. And since the reason they're not in it is what makes them able to write about it, right? They're kind of outsiders, so they're able to make fun of it and they see it differently. and then that, so you have to have just slightly different vision than everyone else in your time, or you are just a part of the you're just participating in the culture rather than documenting the culture.
Exactly. I think the hardest thing in writing is to understand what's necessary from what's not and what you're trying to compose. And that little bit of an outsider's perspective can help so much.
What's something only I could say about this, as opposed to what does everyone else think about this? You have to have this, his take on astronauts is different. His take on, the Merry Pranksters is different. And the same goes, like, nobody else would have saw the Hells Angels the way that Hunter S. Thompson saw them, which is both sort of more heroic in some ways than people anticipated, and then also much darker, much more disturbing, trending towards something real, almost nihilistic. Yeah. And same with Didion. Everyone else would have been going to Woodstock, and here she is sort of just talking about, this is horrible.
Yeah. Los Angeles in 1968, done a lot of research into Bobby Kennedy's death. That last week, James Baldwin was there trying to write a screenplay for Malcolm X. Didion was there. All these writers. I think that as a Westerner, I don't know how you feel, but San Francisco's kind of the city. It's the culture. It's the physical capital for me.
Sure.
Sorry, Sacramento, but it's the physical capital of California. But at that time, so much of the nation, not through the Hollywood sense, but the cultural sense, was, I think now, being defined by that Los Angeles space and scene. And so many writers from all over the world were there when everything was going on. And think of James Baldwin. When Martin Luther King was killed, he was there. When Bobby Kennedy was killed, he was there. He had gone out to Palm Springs to try to get the screenplay done, on Malcolm X. And I think all in their different ways and from their different perspectives of brilliance were feeling something that had always been unraveling and was now on the surface, or was breaking and wrong. And we were kind of getting these fragmented point of views from everyone about what was happening in the larger sense of America.
Right. Yeah. The center will not hold. It's San Francisco and LA. They're sort of both sensing this stuff's not working. It's not adding up. And then California kind of being this island, which people don't see it as that, but this kind of island from the rest of America is sort of maybe suspending them a little bit and allowing them to see it differently. I don't know.
I think you're right. And we forget today how long it took news to get to California. It took the New York, you didn't get the New York Times delivered in the same easy way in the 60s. Sure. You didn't get the same newscasts at the same time before satellites in the late 60s. You had to plan the event, like it's election day, we're going to set a satellite up, or I'm thinking of Hawaii and across the country. But California was a long way. It was much further from the East Coast. Yeah. In terms of the way communication and information worked in the 1960s than it is now.
Yeah, right. And even, the California connection to Hawaii, I think, is kind of forgotten. And just that, California is looking, I think America tends to look towards Europe, but California, there's this understanding of the East being a part of it, right? And even like all this stuff about the China lobby and all this stuff back then, there was just this, people were like, no, the center of gravity is this way. And you're totally missing the picture.
And it was great because then writers one thing I miss today, it still exists really well, but great long form pieces. Yeah. If you're not doing something that's so topical, it has to come out the next day in the New York Times. Sure. These writers could do this great long form work.
Right, you're not jetting down to Washington on the train to take, cover this event. You're having to think about what it means and what it represents. And even the times, like Hollywood operates on such a different timeline than every other bit of media, because a movie takes so long to get made. Yes. So you're just operating on a slightly longer view.
And I think that's something we miss today, the ability not just to mull over it, but creatively try different avenues and aspects formally that we began to see, and they didn't, when you're not working on such a topical issue, you can take more chances sometimes. You're not as rushed.
Do you think with James Salter and Hunter S. Thompson, what's interesting about both of them, Hunter S. Thompson obviously much more so, almost to the point of caricature, but these were both really talented people who also had these sort of like secret lives or addictions or compulsions. And so that's what's fascinating about Hunter S. Thompson, is he's this sort of critic of the excesses of American culture and the ambitions and the egos and the insatiability of someone like Nixon, as if he himself is not hooked on a different drug.
Exactly. And with James Salter, I mean, as a bisexual man, coming out of the military, that was something that he, wasn't writing a memoir about, in 1960.
Sure.
He was writing about sex, and he was writing about differences in power, and he was writing about the danger of it, but also the kind of beauty and rush of it too. And I think it was so informed, that writing, by the thing that he couldn't necessarily write about and be as open. I think Thompson's not, the way Thompson does it, I think a lot of it goes back to his Louisville experience too, feeling it as an outsider there, things you have to be quiet about. You're not part of the family structure there, the families that run Louisville then, that could get you out of trouble if you get in it. You have to be more circumspect. We think of him as this author that will say anything or do anything, but he understood the power structures around him and was always looking for ways to indict them.
Yeah.
And I think relying on his own issues with alcohol addiction, with amphetamine, seeing in these insatiable politicians, like you said, what he's thinking about a lot in his own life on an everyday way.
Well, the big fallacy of Hunter S. Thompson is that he's this disruptive, center of attention, life of the party guy, which he is in his writing, but you're not getting press passes and traveling on the presidential plane or in the motor. He's obviously in the event, some exceptions, much more low-key and self-controlled and blending into the background, or he wouldn't be able to observe the things that he observed. And I think a good chunk of his writing is like what he wished he had said, or what you could have said, what needed to be said, and not what he was literally able to do as a journalist.
Exactly.
Where he's trying to be invisible.
A good comparison, I think, today, and there's not that many, but is a Jordan Klepper from The Daily Show. So you'll see in moments when he's at January 6th or CPAC, the funny interactions, like really, where he's more, he's inserting himself more. But I write about CPAC and some of these other right-wing events. He is spending 90% of the time listening, nodding his head. He's not arguing back. He's doing the grunt work to get all the perspectives and information he can before some of those moments will come up. And Thompson, I bet, at those scenes when he was reporting from the presidential primaries, when he was, sent to do a job, he was invisible like that 90, 95, 98% of the time too, until he got too famous to be later.
It's funny you brought that up, right? Because we were talking about Hunter S. Thompson being the guy that sort of throws out the rules, but it's based on an understanding of mastery. I think when people see Jordan Klepper, you think he's just walking around owning people, making fun of them to their face. Actually, the art of what he does, is first off, he's probably not doing it 90% of the time. You're only seeing a snippet of what gets filmed. And the art of what he's doing is you're not even noticing that you're being owned and made to be a fool. But that, just the sheer amount of those events that he's been to over the years. He knows how to blend in. He knows how to sense who the people are. And it's only for 12 seconds on camera that it gets wild. And then he's probably out before you even notice it.
Exactly.
When he guest hosted The Daily Show, he had me on. He'd read my stuff.
That's great.
And he's awesome.
That's great.
But people probably think that's a fun, raucous, disruptive, put middle finger in your face gig. And almost certainly, to one, get access to the people you need to get access to. And then two, not be lynched by the mob.
Yeah.
You have to have a very artful, fluid ability to do that.
Yeah. The best, and Thompson would do this, we think of him as indicting everybody else, but he allows people to indict themselves by speaking what they think is the correct perspective. And the audience then sees how far away they are from reality often and what they're saying. And Klepper does a great job of that. And Thompson talked to everybody. We forget that too. He read everybody.
Yeah.
So many, I think, young writers today too, they will see maybe writing they disagree with, whether culturally, personally, identity-wise, politically, as being something they don't need to read because they don't agree with it.
Yeah.
And, only a generation earlier, and even us growing up, you had to read everybody. You could take them down and destroy them. You can do whatever you want, but you had to read what you don't agree with. You had to talk to the people at the event who you don't agree with and listen, and they will reveal their positions as they articulate themselves to you.
When you have to be able to do that so you can not get conned, right?
Yes.
Like, so I was telling you about the Stackpole and Sons publishing Mein Kampf. So when Stackpole and Sons, they published their edition, which was the full edition of Mein Kampf. But HMH's edition had a lot of the real bad stuff taken out.
Oh, wow.
That's partly why Hitler was seen the way that he was in America. So when HMH publishes their edition of Mein Kampf, one of the guys sends it to FDR, who'd recently become president. And FDR, you can see this copy I talk about in the piece that I wrote, writes back, I think a letter, maybe in the margins, but he's like livid because he had read Mein Kampf in German, right? Like he'd actually read it. And he was like, this is not what is actually happening here. It's much worse than you say. So FDR had this understanding of the facts, not just the facts on the ground, but the full unpleasantness of the facts, because he engaged with the material as opposed to seeing it from far away. And I think you make a good point about Hunter S. Thompson, which is like Hunter S. Thompson isn't looking at Nixon, let's say, or McGovern, or is it McGovern? No. Who's the bad one?
Humphrey?
No. The conservative that from Arizona.
Goldwater.
He's not looking at those guys the way some people today look at Trump, which is like they read about him in an article, they see the tweets. Like he knew everyone in the campaigns. He'd interviewed the candidates direct. His horror and terror and disgust at them was based on having gotten up close and personal with it and understanding what it is, what it represented, and what the full end game was, which you have to do. You can't pretend it doesn't exist or just be holier than thou about it and self-righteous. You have to know what they're doing, and more, you have to know how they do it.
Yes. And you wrote about this in one of your first books where you talk about media manipulation, and he would watch, Nixon completely stage or create an event and get the version of Nixon wanted to everybody. And he'd watch his entire national press pool just report it dutifully and not question, the artifice of it to begin with. Yes. And that outraged him, but he had to see Nixon up close and see the press's failure to become anything more than a messaging system for the Nixon that Nixon wanted people to see. And that outraged him. And he was great at kind of articulating how easily that was to do.
Yeah. And so what's disruptive and courageous and brave about Thompson is not that he's saying this to Nixon's face, which would have gotten quickly kicked out of said press pool, but it's that he's saying the things that everyone else who's watching is thinking, but not saying.
Yes.
And so
laundering out.
Yes.
Because of their objectivity or their deadline that they need to make.
Right.
But they're being manipulated.
Right.
And that's what he's trying to
They're being manipulated, and they are manipulating.
Exactly.
And that it's a symbiotic relationship.
It pays off for them.
Yes.
Well. And he really captured, which again, you have to be that kind of, I also think of Conrad with language. You're just outside of it, English, but you're within it. And so I love Joseph Conrad's prose as an outsider. I think Thompson as that outsider within the system.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to burn it down, which I think is interesting in the 60s, where you had Oscar Acosta, a civil rights attorney who was throwing firebombs.
Yeah.
And then you have, their letters are great. Thompson's like, wants to live within the system. Acosta wants to burn it down.
Yeah.
And so Thompson wasn't, radical in that. We also see him, I think, more radical now. Like you said, he had more of a conservative, small c strain in him, but he was outraged that his colleagues, who he was both a part of and not, would just keep perpetuating what was going on for their own benefit and for the benefit of others.
One of the things I've thought about from your book more recently, who I know him, the comedian Hassan Minhaj.
Yes.
He's from Davis, Sacramento ish kid.
Oh yeah.
But you think Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, you go, okay, I understand it's not literally true because it's the recollections of a person who is obviously not fully there because they're so high. But I think his reputation would be Hunter S. Thompson's reputation, the reputation of that book would be fundamentally different if we said, well, this was actually 3 trips, as you point out in the book, and the FBI conference you were at, it happened totally differently. You like sort of go, basically that book is emotionally true and factually untrue, which is sort of the distinction he was making in his comedy, that like, look, the large events of this are true and things did happen to me, but I've, amped up the valence here and I've done this here. And people are like, you made it all up. Like he took this major hit about it and probably lost a hosting gig with The Daily Show around it. And from my understanding of history and also art, I'm like, what are you people talking about? And it's interesting the way that not only is it unfair, but it's this interesting way that we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, where we need to go, actually, none of the underlying indictments are true either, which of course could not be further from the truth. Like everything he's saying is true. His personal relationship with it is more or less in some spheres, but you're missing what the point of art is.
I don't know what's happening to the Western mind, but I will say the literal relationship to fact, especially in the last 10 years, is mind-blowing to me. We don't just have to go back to the 60s and the idea of exaggeration and art, and all of these different emotional versus, other types of truth. I wrote a lot about the historical Jesus and Gospels, and that idea that you could keep two things in the human mind at once, that of course, this is exaggerated to prove a point, and still this is a narrative that feels true or I want. It doesn't have to be either or.
Sure.
And our either or moment, it blows my mind right now, and then, at least hypocrisy, which is what Thompson was talking about so much then, but which is really dangerous because it's, my fiance will say, like, we're not thinking well. Like, we're not thinking well if everything has to be a dichotomy or a black and white yes or no situation. And that response is similar, what you're talking about, to what I think is going wrong right now. And I just think Thompson was so good. And so many of those. What does Conrad say? Like, life is short and art is long and success is very far off.
Yeah.
That this is something that's been practiced and engaged for so many thousands of years by so many people. And to take not just our lens right now and map it onto the more recent American past or whatever, but to think that it's always been this way. And that we're not in a conversation with the technology that's all around us, the voices of people that are long gone, to me is mind-blowing. And I think we're getting stupider because of that. And I sound so old. It kind of blows my mind. But we need to think. I don't know how we're going to think better if we can only think in yes or no.
I think if you watch the tape of Hunter S. Thompson at the Kentucky Derby, and then you read the story, you'd be like, oh, you made the entire thing up. But that's not what that story is about. Yeah. And the same, if you actually, what could you verify from those trips to Las Vegas? Probably more of it is not true than is true. Yeah. But the book's not about what happened in Las Vegas. The book is about the high watermark of the 60s. Exactly. It's all about that observation. It's about the essence and the vibe and the feeling that he's trying to capture. And what new journalism was a kind of a merging of fiction and nonfiction.
Exactly.
And comedy does that now too. And you're missing the point if you try to be this sort of strict literist. Like, there's a difference between the irony then of simultaneously being a culture where you have someone like Trump who is objectively a liar, but people accept it because they want it to be true or because it feels like to have literally the most dishonest person to ever hold the office simultaneously be popular with a large segment of the population because he is a truth teller is this weird double standard where, like, the people that we should be hearing the emotional truth from, we hold literally, we hold to the standard of literalness. And then the people who are actual officials or scientists, etc., who we need to be holding to a literal standard, we allow to get off with, well, they're telling me what I want to hear. It's a very strange situation.
And it reminds me of, in kind of a tangential way, but the passage in Didion's The White Album where she's with Jim Morrison.
Yeah.
And how she writes about it. She goes to the recording session. They're waiting for Jim Morrison. Yeah. He shows up. He doesn't talk to anybody. He's like, should we do this? And they're like, we can't. And Didion's like, I don't even know in whose favor the conversation, was determined. In real life, what happened, Evie Babbitt's her friend talks about this, who had dated Morrison, brought her there. She was flirting with Jim Morrison. He was throwing the matches at her. Oh. It was such a different reality than how she articulated it. That piece's emotional truth is mind-blowing. I love that passage about how she captures what the doors are expected to be, what they are.
Yeah, they're like, should we go? They're like making like they're supposed to be this revolutionary, artistic, whatever group, and they're just like, should we drive back from West Covina tonight?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just this. It's so she presents them as so pedantic and ordinary that it essentially like flays them.
Yeah.
And why is she doing that? That's, I guess, a different question. But yeah, the idea that it could have happened very differently.
Exactly. And then still, everything's true there. She had a fact checker. She just chose to leave out certain other parts. And I think she did a very nice job of capturing what we thought a rock band was.
Yeah.
Leather pants, sex and death, and then the kind of everyday nature of it. And that, is
like 4 coworkers or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's like, they're eating like boiled eggs out of a paper bag, like she's counting the number of buttons on the control panel. But even then, she's narrowing from reality all the different things that did happen that night into her version of what she wants to say. And nothing is untrue about that. It's just think of all she leaves out to get there. And I think we are even struggling to understand that in terms of subjectivity and nonfiction and truth in the present right now.
Well, I actually, the epigraph is to Trust Me, I'm Lying, is the James Agee quote, where it's basically saying that fundamentally journalism is a form of lying because you're taking disparate events and coordinating them to tell a story that you want to tell. And you're leaving things out. And then there's that famous, what's her name, the Janet Malcolm thing about how fundamentally journalism is also this act of aggression and hostility.
Yes.
Didion talks about this too, where you're like, you and the source have an adversarial relationship, and you're just looking for where you're going to bury the knife.
Yeah.
And if you don't put the knife in, it's only because you're using them in some ways to get up to someone else or something else, or they fit your. And so, we don't see journalism that way because, again, coming out of the 60s, we see it as this inherently noble pursuit. It speaks truth to power, it brings out presidents, which it does. I was telling Hassan that, I was saying, like, obviously post-writing Trust Me, I'm Lying, I have this relationship where I see clearly the importance of journalism. I mean, especially when you have sort of a neo-fascistic movement, you have disinformation and misinformation where real lives are hanging in the balance. And at the same time, when I watch stories like what happened to him, or I watch miss the boat on other things, you go, oh yeah, you're like, you are also part of the problem. You're like, I don't know what the alternative is, but like, you're complicit in the whole system too, and you are as much a vehicle for untruth as you are truth.
Exactly. I think Barry Weiss's response to has been amazing, the Israel Palestine conflict. We got to that topic very quickly, but the way that she's covering that ever since early October has been brilliant, and as a way to cut through what's inhibiting or the failures of major journalistic outlets right now in dealing with sending reporters out, talking to people on the ground. She, with her podcast and with the Free Press, has done an amazing job. So that's kind of the more, in a tough time, saving lives in a brilliant way, I think, of dealing with it right now.
Well, and then there is no such thing as a perfect messenger, right? So like, I know Barry, I like Barry. I think she's carried water for the wrong people quite often. And then there are moments where she really nails it, right? And I think you could make the same point about Hunter Stops. There are a lot of great. It's like sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they don't, right? And you sort of, that's why you have to have this broad group of people you get your information from. You can't just, I just read this. The dumbest people I know just get their news from the television. Do you know what I mean? Like, you go, okay, this is a problem.
And it's so hard though, because I wish my father would watch CBS News, and like instead it's on Facebook. Like I think that you're right. I think that we've also lost the idea of getting news, of getting an information and perspective by a 400-page book, written 40 or 50 years ago.
So that's why I loved your book. So like, I have found the best book I read during COVID was John M. Barry's book, The Great Influenza.
Oh, wow.
Right. So you're reading about the Spanish flu and you're like, okay, here's everything that's true. Right. The best way I understood Trump was Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. And I feel like your book actually, which is basically the generation right after that book, like you're talking about no longer does the fascist movement look like Mussolini or Hitler. It's figured out how to dress better. It's figured out how to co-opt certain kinds of speech and language. It's less, it's more velvet glove, than iron fist. But Hunter S. Thompson is writing about the exact same things that are happening right now. The same types of politicians. Like, my understanding of the civil rights movement and has changed how, when I look at some of these governors, like when I look at the governor of Texas, when I look at DeSantis, I understand them now through the lens of George Wallace or this certain kind of Southern governor. Same with some of the senators, but you're like, oh, this is a type of person. Just like there's types of movies, this is a type of person. And this person has something that resonates with large groups of people for long periods of time. You have to understand the game that they are playing. And you have to take that very seriously. And I found that people don't have the historical basis to do that. So they just look at, oh, DeSantis doesn't like the people that I like, or whatever. And you're not getting the game that he's playing and how dangerous it actually is and where it inevitably ends up.
Where it leads to.
Yeah.
And the inherent fragility
Yeah.
to our system that we kind of take for granted. How it can be co-opted. It can be co-opted in the ways you're exactly talking about. I mean, I always think about how George Wallace Thompson wrote about this. Was running for president in 1972 on an independent platform. Will be shot eventually in Olney, Maryland, but this is when he's still kind of ramping up. There's other candidates, other Democratic candidates, going to Florida trying to win. You have Muskie taking the whistle stop tour, down, trying to coordinate everything perfectly. And George Wallace just goes to a NASCAR event. Yeah. He has 300,000 people in the audience. He speaks beforehand, and he is reaching everyone. He is getting the free publicity and the exposure that the other candidates are paying everything they have and positioning themselves to somehow reach, and instead are just getting further away from the voters that they want.
Yeah, he understands where the people are and what they want to hear.
Yeah.
And
it's dangerous.
Yeah, right. And if you don't have the conscience that protects you, it's a problem. So you need politicians who are astute and artists who are astute, critics who are astute to understand what's happening and to not just let it happen and report on it as it's happening.
Exactly. And I thought about that a lot when, it was whatever our present day moment is, it's not any more difficult than all the ones from the repeated past, going back thousands and thousands of years. And it's not more singular, but it is, like all those other moments, it's its own version. And when I was in a bad media diet where I still am, I'm sure, outrage was generating what I was reading in the New York Times, what I was reading in the New Yorker.
Sure.
Well, I find the writer that's expressing the emotion I feel right now. Please, Adam Gopnik, say what I feel. I realized going just back into the past, even a few generations, to try to look at the same issues and the same, human conflicts that we're seeing now was a way to kind of access both the present and what I was trying to say or think about the present in a better way.
Well, the idea, the economics of a book are fundamentally different than the economics of media, right? Like a book is designed, the newspaper story you read or the online article, whatever, is designed to be replaced immediately by the next thing the next day, or now on the internet, the next tweet 5 minutes later. A book, because it takes so long to do, it, by definition, has to have a little more staying power, right? It has to have, it has to continue to be true for longer, has to have a larger view normally. And then I think this is the most important part that's fundamentally different about what we would call journalism, is that you pay for it individually, right? Not even, there's a problem with, like, as they say, if it's free, you're the product that's being sold. But an article inside a package of other information, right, is different than this, which is designed to be self-sufficient and self-justifying. Like, you buy this, you read it, it is worth what you paid for it. That is a different value proposition with a different set of incentives. And people don't really think about the incentives that are operating under the information that they're consuming and how those incentives are warping and changing that information. And if you can't see that, then you fall prey to that bias. Just like people who spend too much time on Twitter get their brain warped, people watch too much news, TV get their brain warped.
Yeah.
If you're only reading books, you also can live in this world where there's only these big truths and not real events happening on the ground. So you need a balance, but I think fundamentally it's better to go back further. It's better to read things that are older. It's better to read things where the significance of the partisanship has gone away, right? So when you're reading about Hunter S. Thompson and his judgments on Nixon, even if you're a Republican, you don't give a shit that Nixon is a Republican. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's so long ago.
And he's not going to come back. It's like, oh no, he's going to come back and take over.
You're just thinking of him and whether his judgments of that person's character or flaws or decisions were right or wrong. The greatest biographer of all time is Plutarch, right? Yeah. Plutarch is writing not whether, and he admits, he goes, I don't know if all this stuff is true or not. And he's like, and I'm not going to tell you exactly where they were born, what they lived, how this happened. Mm-hmm. He's like, because an action or a word or an anecdote is more revealing about the essence of what's true than anything else. And so when you read about Alexander the Great, or when you read about the Catalan conspiracy, you're thinking, this is what human beings do. This is bad. This is why, this or that. Well, the same thing is happening right now on January 6th or whatever. And then you're able to go, oh, okay, what my party is saying I should think here, or what this outlet is saying, you're able to get to the historical essence and the timelessness of that, which is really ultimately what matters.
Yeah. I mean, I had read the Catalonian orations probably 25 years ago, some of the first Latin. Yeah. I was like trying to find the verb and the tense, but still Cicero like indicting Catalan, and I didn't think of it again. I mean, 25 years later, until after January 6th, I had been there reporting, and I remember the Catalonian orations. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I remember the devices, and I remember the stakes in a way that I had forgotten, the way that came back. It kind of blew my mind.
Well, yeah, you have this guy who feels entitled and like he's earned it and that he should be in charge, and then somebody else wins, and then he even though he couldn't be further from the mob or the population, he stirs them up and sicks them on the establishment. And then, then there's also, interestingly enough, in there, I've kind of the overreaction of Cicero. Like Cicero wants this to be the crisis of his lifetime, and the irony is it's not. It's not minor, but it's it was probably never going to work. Yeah. And in his overreaction to it, ironically, sets up his lack of credibility when he really could have been necessary when the Republic is overthrown, just a few years later. And so, like, we previously would have had a culture where everyone read that when they were learning Latin, and then they didn't learn Latin, so you don't read it. And then you go, well, why? If it's not about learning Latin, why would we study this? It's a long time ago. It's old, dead white guys, whatever. And then we don't have this shared cultural consciousness to be able to draw, like, to understand why we have the norms that we have, why we have the words that we have. Like, how many people even know that it's the riot at the Capitol is named after Capitoline Hill? Exactly. You know what I mean? And that the center, all these words come from a thing. And if you don't understand that, the significance of each one of the things don't matter, and you can end up in a place where it's all kind of emptied of significance, and then the stakes, which are quite high, don't feel as high as they are.
I was on a panel last week at the University of Virginia called the Canonical and the Banned, which is about the canon and banned books. And I one thing I thought about talking with the fellow, they were great. The canon's a living thing. We think of the canon as this old thing that needs to be rejected or accepted. And this is a more, recent experience. The canon is something we're constantly responding to and saying, like, was Cicero as good as we thought? Like, was Thucydides complicit or correct? And I think even going back to Herodotus, look at how he hedges his bets when he says, I don't know if this is true, but, and the way that, not just in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of honesty, truth, and art, all these different voices for over thousands of years. Of course, there's gaps. Of course, people have been left out, have tried to articulate their experience, is one of the most valuable things humanity has today are all these voices through a technology of the book that still are here. And my students sometimes will, and my students are great creative writing MFA students, again, the idea that it's harmful or wrong or will be bad for you to read somebody else's perspective or point of view from the past, or you should shrug it off because, they were a terrible tyrant or what have you. Like what the canon offers us is a conversation to respond to.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's missing today,
Well, there's even this sense like that the Greeks and the Romans were all these old dead white guys, right? And like even in the case of the Stoics, Seneca's born in Spain, right? Epictetus is a slave. Marcus Aurelius is an emperor. That's an incredible swath of diversity just in those three characters, right? Zeno, some people think he might have been African or had some African blood in him. And so you have this actually incredibly diverse group, diverse not just in terms of race or origin, but also in experience, which is a stand-in for the larger sense of diversity. So it's so closed-minded to say that. And then there, of course, like it was largely male-centric, but like it was only when I really studied it, I go, Brutus's wife is Cato's daughter. And so, and there's this, even in the Shakespeare play and in Plutarch, you get this interesting interplay between Brutus and his wife. His wife, we make Brutus the main character, but if you were presenting that today, you would show Brutus almost certainly as somewhat cowardly and vacillating, and it's his wife who steals him with courage and sort of puts him to it. And so actually, it's not that there weren't women involved. It's just in how we've talked about it. And so it is the canon and our understanding of history and the story can be changed without even adding anything new. It's just what are you emphasizing and how, like Plutarch renders Portia Cato as a not heroic figure, but you could just as easily reimagine that, which is, by the way, what they were doing. That there's 1,000 plays about Hercules and 1,000 plays about all the, Oedipus. Every generation, they were just rewriting in the same way that we make and remake the Marvel movies. And even just the early Marvel movies versus now, they're more diverse. There's women have greater roles. They're tackling the issues of the day. That's what the classics were. The problem was we just stopped at some point and we said, this is it. It's baked. And in fact, it's never been baked, and it's always been possible to reimagine and add. And just it's really an anachronism that we see them all the same, in the same way that we see all white people today as the same. When a generation ago here in America, Italian people didn't feel white. That's why they put up statues of Columbus. They were trying to celebrate one of their guys, which again it's interesting how that experience is literally incomprehensible to us. We can't see. We see Columbus as a racist figure, which, as a figure of colonialism. But in 1922, if you're an Italian immigrant, you see representation in Columbus.
Yes, and you could be whiter.
Yeah.
If you could identify with Columbus, it was a way to pass within society in a different way.
Or to just be proud of something in yourself.
Exactly. One thing I try to do in my writing and my perspective, which I'm as guilty as anybody, but how do we not map this American moment and its recent history onto all of the conflicts and problems we see in the world now and also in the past? I mean, how do we not bring our idea of power, identity, culture, gender, which we have a different way of talking about it now than we did even 20 years ago, 40 years ago, to these moments from 4,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. I love the podcast, The Rest is History, the two British guys that do it. I mean, I just love it because they are able to say, I don't think you understood what was happening, when Nero's first wife died, and then he forced the slave to become a eunuch, that he named after that. It's like to bring our current perspective onto that. It may be insightful right now, but there's also a logic there that's like a relic been lost to time that we have to work to understand again through the writings that exist and through the engagement we're still offered by, again, the technology of writing that allows us.
These labels and these ideas don't always hold true. So like I remember in Ron Chernow's biography of Grant, which I'm fascinated by Grant. I've read pretty much everything ever written on Grant. And Chernow talks about him repeatedly as an alcoholic, which he may or may not have been. But certainly Grant did not know he was an alcoholic because that wasn't a thing.
Yes.
Right?
That's our language now.
Yeah. And so the conceit is inherently problematic, right?
Yes.
So Grant might be drinking, might not be drinking, but the sense that he is addicted to a thing and he can't stop doing the thing is a modern conception.
Yes.
Right? Another version of this is there are these students at Brown University every couple of years, they protest this statue of Marcus Aurelius that's on campus because Marcus Aurelius was an imperialist or a colonizer. And he literally that is true. That's what Rome was, the imperial empire. But first off, it's a fundamentally different form of colonization. And second of all, it was 2,000 years ago, right? And the idea that you're going to take a label about a thing we're struggling with now and project it backwards is problematic. It doesn't mean that that's not that there's not interesting thinking to be done about how did Rome conceive of its role as an imperial country. And what's fascinating is that they had all the same debates that we had now. The idea was an enterprising politician would get assigned to one of the colonies, which they would proceed to loot, right? Yes. But not everyone thought that was fair or a good idea. And there was lots of criticism even of that at the time. And so to reduce it as this singular thing that everyone was on board with that we now say is bad is to miss actually the more timeless thing that's happening, which is there are sort of good incentives, bad incentives, good actors and bad actors within a society. And society and the way history judges a group depends on how that battle plays out. Yes. And in fact, that same battle is playing out now. So to dismiss the Romans as imperialists is, I think, academic and somewhat pointless. It's better to go, where are we like them?
Yes.
Why did the good guys win or lose? And what lessons can we take from that? In the same way that we have to, like, it's a slightly different discussion with, I think, monuments to Confederates or the Lost Cause, because that is an ongoing myth those were put up to wage a certain kind of intellectual warfare to prop up a system that continues to exist to this day. And there's a difference between that happening in a museum as a historical artifact and as a civic monument that you pay to upkeep now. Yeah. But like you can't just reduce it as this all one or the other thing. You have to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and to not be able to do that is, to me, the sign of a weak mind and a self-righteous mind that is actually incapable of making the world better.
And it makes me sad because that used to be a starting point. We all got things wrong. We're like, oh, Rome is an imperialist power. It's like, okay, well, now read everything that you can and use your current day lens to come to a new opinion. But that's a way to not have to do that or not have to keep engaging. It's the end of the conversation instead of the beginning of a conversation. And I see liberal arts education as, spending 4 years reading other people's perspectives and within fiction or nonfiction or poetry, going into their perspective and seeing the world for however long you're reading as somebody different than yourself. And then you come back out into your perspective and you can't see the world the same way. You expand through looking at the world via these stories that other people have left. And I just always remember, I don't know if it's a conservative and liberal thing, but like at the 2016 convention, I was writing about it. And this is the fear of outside information. Like we have to remember on both sides, like especially the liberal side, the more information you have, the more time you spend seeing through somebody else's mind, whether it's an emperor from 2,000 years ago, whether it's whoever it is, then coming back to yours, you can do again what I think is the hardest thing. And this isn't just in writing, but in life, to understand or try to see what's necessary from what's not, and I think that we're so lucky to have had a conversation going on for so long, to have all, I was walking through your bookstore and I saw the Peloponnesian War, one of my favorite books. And I I don't know. I only make 2 nuclear war jokes a semester. That's my limit with my students, but I think I've already reached it. But, in the last 10 years before the present and how we kind of slant it, that hadn't been as large a conversation, nuclear war, as in the past. But that conversation between Sparta and Athens and whether to aggressively go on the Athenian part and invade, and what could happen, what the consequences could be, still feels as relevant and ever. And not like a peace or not, but I always think of Syracuse, and sending the fleet to Syracuse. And it was so awful that when people came back, the few survivors of the fleet, to tell the Athenians what had happened, they wouldn't believe them, that the whole fleet could be gone. They were executed for even saying it.
Well, when General Mattis was Secretary of Defense, he assigned a history of the Peloponnesian War as a book for people to read, because what they call it, the Thucydides trap, the idea of a dominant power and an ascendant power, and China and America would maybe talk about which one is ascendant, which one's dominant, which is ironic, but the idea of how these clashes play out. So instead of, obviously the state and the Defense Department have access to the latest cables, latest studies, greatest intelligence. And here they are reading a 2,500-year-old book about a war fought by ships that had oars, to give you a sense of how long ago it was. The ships would clash and then the men would jump off and fight each other with swords, as if it was the ground. That's how long ago this was. And yet the same things are happening. I'm just writing about this in the book I'm doing now, the Melian dialogue or Melian dialogue. Like the most famous passage in the history of the Peloponnesian War is basically Athens going to this little proxy client state and going, might makes right, is the strong do what they can and the weak struggle as they must, right? As today we talk about, systemic racism and structural problems and intersection. That is the same discussion, right? But how many people that throw these buzzwords around could actually connect it to some sort of classical understanding of that, some real insight into human nature that goes back far enough that you're not thinking Republican, Democrat, white, black, America, whatever. It's taking it back far enough you can see what humans do and how a lot of the systems we developed, the stories we tell, the institutions we build were designed to counteract those impulses.
Yes.
Right? Like the UN being one such invention, right? Or treaties being another invention, or the Geneva Convention. We've invented stuff to deal with things, and sometimes we forget the source of that insight or that hard-won lesson. And so to not have that historical basis is just an enormous liability. So people talk about STEM and how we need to learn math, whatever. But if you don't have an understanding of how humans work and how they've always worked, what good is your ability to build really good rockets or whatever?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And it goes back, I guess, to 2 ways. One is there's such a human element to all of this writing too. When you talk about Seneca a lot, I'll never forget his practicing death essay. When he's talking about is it tuberculosis or asthma? He had a really bad attack. He's like, I am practicing death. And reading that the first time, that was it's a letter, I think, and I read it in Latin, and then I read it again in a translation. The Latin's like having done, with all the participles, but then the translation, John de God, it's a great translation. He goes, I am practicing death. And that's the first line as the translation comes off. And so even within, these larger issues, those moments of human, suffering and perspective, how is that not going to make somebody a better writer today to read that? And I guess the second thing is with Thompson, exactly what you're talking about, these different structures, he understood their inventiveness and their fragility. And if somebody gets enough power, especially in the post-war world with nuclear weapons where you have to make a decision in 5 minutes whether to respond, we're dealing with stakes that the human mind can't really, conceptualize. I think that's the Susan Sontag quote is we can understand the death of a person. We can't understand the death of a species. Of us, of humankind.
Well, I mean, even in the pandemic, it's clear people have real trouble thinking about the effect of their decisions on other people, right? And so, of course, we're going to struggle with bigger, tragedy of the commons issues like the environment or public trust or what, that's going to be, if we can't just go, hey, I have this, or I might have this, so I'm going to stay home, or I'm going to get this vaccine, or I'm going to wear this mask, or whatever it is, or that the whole reason that governments exist is to bind people together to solve problems like that.
Yes.
Because groups of people can't self-organize quickly enough or voluntarily enough. That's what it's all there for. And so if you can't do that, in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius is going, there's two types of plagues. There's a plague that can destroy your life and a plague that can destroy your character. He was writing that during the Antonine Plague. He would have understood how these extreme, difficult, disorienting, scary events fuck with people and bring out the worst in some people and the best in other people. And yet none of these problems or issues are new. And all of the great literature is about this. I forget, I was reading one of the Greek players. It might have been Euripides or it might have been Aeschylus. But it's like, I'm reading this play and I go, oh, it's like about somebody getting revenge, and then this jury gets set up and you go, oh, this is the invention of juries.
Yeah, exactly.
Like somebody came up with that. They were like, hey, somebody gets wronged. They try to get justice by themselves. They end up hurting themselves and other people in the process. So let's come up with a system that solves that. Yes. And you're like, this is a play. It's not art, but it's a play designed to try to solve this problem that is clearly fundamental to societies, which is groups of people living together. And that's what all of this stuff is. And it was all invented at some point. It didn't wasn't given to us. We invented it.
Think then 2,500 years later, on the night that Martin Luther King is shot, Bobby Kennedy, who was a Philistine for most of his life, but after his very public tragedy, began to read the Greeks, began to read
I have the book in the bookstore. He has Edith, what's her name?
Perlman? No, Edith
Wharton. I don't know. So is it Edith something? And she wrote this book called The Greek Way, which is a sample survey course of all the Greek plays. And that's where he gets, what does he say? We drop by drop, we suffer unto truth, or something like that.
He quotes, she had made it like monotheistic, like even in our sleep, pain or suffering, drop by drop comes onto the heart until, through the awful grace of God, we arrive at understanding.
Yes. Basically, we learn through pain and suffering. And he was saying, I've learned through pain and suffering the loss of my brother. Yeah. You're now mourning Martin Luther King. Rioting, anger, pain, whatever won't do anything, won't solve this. We got to come together. And then I think the irony then, 50 years later, his son is clearly motivated by some profound grievance, and maybe he got kicked in the head by a horse or something, or something broke inside that person. And he is now a vehicle for a more modern version of those same things, which is now a group doesn't have to get together and burn down buildings and whatever. You can just spread like a virus bad, destructive ideas that tear at the fabric of society and what underpins the modern health system, and it's just as destructive.
And there's a great book on immunity by Eula Biss, and it was the first time reading it. She's a nonfiction writer. It was the first time I began to understand. She articulated that immunity is not about you.
Yes.
It's about how the participation. And she had been writing it while she was pregnant in the 2010s. And she'd a great writer had gone to Iowa, and it was the first time I step back and realize, like, those systems you talk about, it's about your participation in them, not to protect you, but so all of us can come together and get a different outcome than we used to get individually.
We have this understanding of America being about liberty, which it is, but there's liberty and then there's responsibility. Yeah. And they were seeing, the idea was government would create liberty, and then philosophy and culture would create virtue. And these two things have to coexist or operate together for the package to work. Washington orders the vaccination of his troops against smallpox when like 1 in 4 people died from the vaccine. Like when it was they're just even in that early moment wrestling with, individual versus collective, and how do these things come together. And so again, when you can read about the ethics of this issue 300 years ago, it helps inform how you think about it now. There's this super moving thing that Benjamin Franklin writes about his decision not to vaccinate his son, and he dies, and it tears apart his marriage and his life. Not to get on a vaccine tangent, but the point is, almost none of the issues are new. They're struggling. Yes. We're struggling with them in the same way, just the names and dates and places and characters. They change, but the problems stay the same, you know? And that's just kind of what's always been happening.
And you've written about this a lot too, but you talked about it a little bit just now, where bad information, really virulent information, is like a virus. And this goes back to anti-Semitism, the Elders of Zion. It's a way of thinking, that actually infects the way the rest of your mind thinks. There's a great book, Wasteland, about Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot that came out recently. There's a biography of the poem, The Wasteland. And you just saw Ezra Pound's mind deteriorating with not syphilis, but anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
It is really interesting. Like the way I was talking to someone about this recently, I was saying that anti-Semitism may be the oldest virus.
Yeah.
And it's this thing it infects the Romans, different emperors at different times, different leaders at different times. And then, these different tropes or different, the Elders of the Protocol of Zion, what's it called? It's not that old, right?
No. And it's like Russian propaganda.
It's just this thing, this horrible thing that someone puts out in the world, and then it can't be eradicated. And
you're right. It's
you can be immunized against it with information and understanding, but it's just going around but if you lack the firewalls for it, it can my metaphors are getting very mixed here, but if you lack the different, it can go big or small. And there are these certain viruses, and I've watched it happen with people I know, even people that are fans of mine, where it's like, you can kind of see it. You follow people on Instagram, and then it's like, oh, I haven't seen a picture of their spouse in a while. And then it's like announcing they're separated, and then announcing you kind of sense, you're like, oh, you kind of keep this mental tab, where they are in that transition, right? Yeah. And you kind of go, oh, okay, they just retweeted something from Elon Musk. And then, now they're talking about trans women in sports. And you kind of watch this. It's like this evolution. The metaphor they use is about taking the red pill, but it's actually not a thing, and you get it. You don't actually there's this latency period where it's kind of working on you, and you don't understand it. And maybe it was escapable, maybe it wasn't. But I'm very fascinated with the way that these kind of idea viruses get into a person and how they change. I mean, Elon Musk is, on the one hand, anti-Semitism goes way back to his grandfather, who fled to South Africa precisely because he was an anti-Semite and thought there should be an apartheid regime in South Africa. He didn't go there and there was apartheid. He was like, this is our chance, So there's this predisposition towards it, clearly, in that family. And then you kind of watch, towards conspiratorial thinking, right? And then you watch as his information diet changes and his place in the world changes, and then maybe he gets criticized here or there, and then all of a sudden, who he was 5 years ago. I read the first bio, the Ashley Vance bio of Elon Musk, and then I read the Walter Isaacson. It's the same person, but it's not the same person. He's been fundamentally changed and remade by the information that he's consumed.
And it's terrifying too, because you talk about it, imagine as immunity or a set system, and then it comes through. I think of Steve Bannon, I'll go to CPAC and write about what's going on there. And this year I saw him at his private party, and I know he's read everything, but I know it's not an immunity to the conspiracies. Again, but I asked him, everybody's there. They want to be him, which is very strange. That's like the podcaster. So how do I do my podcast? How do I be a Steve Bannon? So I was, what's your favorite George Orwell? Because I know he's talked about it. And he said homage to Catalonia. I'm like, that's my favorite, George Orwell. Sure. But you then realize that may have been it a long time ago. now he's mapping a completely different narrative
Yes.
onto that even exists now with some of it there. And so if that was part of his immunity or anybody's immunity is reading other people's perspectives, what happens when the virus goes so far that now every pre-existing thing can just be like taken apart piecemeal to prove what you already feel or believe? And that was kind of terrifying to me.
Or you can have this almost kind of schizophrenic where you know all this stuff, but that gets in the way of what you want to do. Like you're not even seeing yourself as the person who's doing what you're, you know what I mean? Like you can't, what's that question? Are we the baddies? You know, like you can't even ask that question anymore because something has happened or your self-interest is dependent on you kind of not understanding it. It's a weird, but the idea that, this is what happens to Cataline. You know what I mean? Like 2,200 years ago or 2,100 years ago, whatever it is, this guy, you know, he's probably has these dinner parties and they go, you'd be way better, man, you know? And he grew up with his parents telling him how great he was. And then he goes, well, I bet I could, you know, he's just looking at it at pieces in the chessboard and not going, am I burning this whole thing down just for me? You know?
He never questions it.
Yeah.
I just think it's tough when we, you know, it gets back to part of our censorship talks too. Like I teach Shooting an Elephant today, you know, by George Orwell. I love Homage to Catalonia. There's parts of it where he's talking about what Orwell's talking about what he was like as a colonial administrator and how he knew colonialism was wrong, but it's a lot like Thompson. He was caught up in enforcing it. So he shows how it destroys him as a way to argue against it, which Thompson does a very good job of too. But, you know, the talk of editing parts of Orwell now, you know, instead of dealing with some of the, you know, like language that he has in it, to me is mind blowing, like within our present, and just scrambles that goody or baddie argument immediately, you know? And it's to me really dangerous because it's, like the example you gave with Roosevelt, it's tinkering with something so essential, information that is essential to us, like, you know, his perspective. So I don't know, you know, I think about our current media situation. It freaks me out a lot when, and this gets back to the canon and banned books, it freaks me out a lot when we're going beyond our online like fights with each other. And there's the idea that because our lens is the latest and the most important, we now can begin to take out certain passages of Orwell or edit them. And I mean, I don't think that's any way inherent to the present, but I do think so much is magnified right now by the way that we wake up in the morning and become accustomed to communicating with our phones or with everybody else.
Yes. Yeah. And also like we used to, the reason for these, I noticed this the other day. So I was reading my kids, I was telling them the story of the Odyssey. And, you know, I told them the story of Cyclops. I'm forgetting his name, but, you know, Odysseus says,
Polyphemus.
You know, what's his name?
Is it Polyphemus?
Yeah, Polyphemus.
Yeah.
You know, he says, what's your name? And he says, No Man. And then so they go, hey, who poked out my eye? He says, no man picked out my eye. And my kids just lose their mind. Like, this is the funniest joke. Yeah. And now they do all this. Anytime they do anything wrong, you know, I go like, who punched your brother? And I go, no man punched my brother. You know, like they're just playing with this language in a way that someone almost 3,000 years ago or more was playing with language is incredible, right? Yeah. And so we could be celebrating the sort of timelessness and the uniquely humanness of all of that. And so there are these things that sort of ring true and good. And then there's the same kind of dark urges that tyrants and dictators and populists and demagogues have also been playing up. And you have to understand both of those, right? What makes Lincoln so great is this understanding of biblical language and story, right? This king draws on the same ideas. And then, what people are throwing out today, of course it's not going to resonate. Like you're not you don't have the underlying understanding or information to make this more than what it is, and to really speak to that part of people that you have to bring out to get them to do things. It's exactly what Hunter S. Thompson is saying, that just like our energy will prevail alone, or the righteousness of our cause will prevail alone. And it's so much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of when I was like, again, 18, my whole Latin class, Jesuit high school Bellarmine in California, was the first 6 books of the Aeneid. And so translating that, and I'll never forget, there's a passage where Virgil's writing, and there's a lot of different backgrounds to what's going on. But in the epic poem, and someday Rome won't exist anymore either. It's stepping back. And it's a fact. There will be a day America does not exist, but being an 18-year-old boy with my boy brain and sitting back and looking around and being like, this country is not going to exist someday too.
Sure.
And having that realization, the presentness of our lives, the instantaneousness of our lives, it doesn't just make us, focused on our phones or screens or who said something. It makes us blind in the way humans want to be to very clear facts that this country, these people, we're all going to die someday anyways, as the Stoics will tell you. They're already dead, but you know better than anybody. But this country itself, just in the way Rome was, is going to be gone. And whatever an 18-year-old boy's brain is, it is malleable. You can give it good writing and good perspectives. And those magnets, they're not going to hurt, And so I've always remembered that moment of looking up and stepping back from the book.
When to think, why is Virgil putting it in there? He's writing to Augustus. Yeah. Right. And he's trying to get that to him. And so it's heightened by the sense of like, well, what's the author trying to do here? What's the message that they're delivering? Right. To see Meditations as a book being written in a plague. Right. Or to see, I think it's Euripides, is writing as a veteran of this horrible war and trying to process the trauma of what he went through. Seneca's plays being his inability to outwardly criticize Nero and the regime and having to sublimate it in fiction. Shakespeare basically makes one overt mention of current day issues, and it basically nearly ends his life. And so the rest of Shakespeare is all about Greece and Rome and things hundreds of years in the past, because that's the only way he can speak to it. The benefit, though, is that it also speaks to us and it disarms. It gets underneath our resistance to you. Who are you to tell me about this or that? And so to understand, that's what art is supposed to do, is to touch us in these places. And when you're banning it because it's politically incorrect or not diverse enough or whatever, you're missing actually what it is, the truth of it, how representative it is, and the fact that the point is that there really is only one human experience.
Yeah. I did a political writing class. I teach graduate students, but this was undergraduates during the pandemic. So we read a lot of Thompson, we read a lot of Didion, we read James Baldwin, we read a lot of different writers from the 20th century. And what I wanted my students to see was, look at how they're doing exactly what you said. Yeah. Even in these really like political instances at a convention, taking and dramatizing the moment so the reader can do the work to come and arrive at their own conclusion. An op-ed is the opposite of art, and an op-ed is the answer. I love the line from Claudia Rankine quotes it, but art are the questions like we arrive at after we've gone through all the answers. Yeah. And like I'm probably mangling it, but this idea that in that class they needed to dramatize or write a story about maybe something political in Washington, D.C. And these, I don't usually teach undergraduates, they were undergraduates, all op-eds. Yeah. And I'd be like, well, where did you see this kind of writing earlier in our examples? They'd be like, well, Joan Didion says we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Yeah. So I'm like, did you miss the rest of that essay? That's all dramatized to make the reader do work, to engage it the same way Shakespeare had to move around something and tell that story in a different way. And same how, I think through my scene is like Virgil had to reach Augustus. Yes. And if he just told Augustus in op-ed fashion.
This is how you get exiled or worse.
Yes, or worse. You're exactly right. And I think a lot of students want to arrive at op-eds now as somehow the purest form of the expression they want, where that's the starting place maybe to figure out what you think or feel, and now put the messiness of humanity and the world around you into a story that might articulate it where the reader can do work and not just be given an answer.
Yeah, to think that it's harder to do, but it ultimately reaches more people because the defense is down. Hunter S. Thompson is writing Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, not about drugs, but about the American dream. Yeah. That, to me, Hell's Angels is captured by the quote. He says, myths and legends die hard in America because they prove to us that the tyranny of the rat race is not yet final. The Hell's Angels were a revolt against the corporatization and the buzz cut buttoned down sort of world that had come out of the Second World War. But Thompson isn't celebrating them. He's saying that the cure is maybe worse than the disease.
Yes.
He shows them, doing a gang rape, right? I think there's all this criticism now about the new Michael Lewis book about Sam Bankman-Fried. And it's like, he fillets this dude. There's a quote in the book where he goes, "I don't think I have a soul," right? Like Lewis's job as the journalist is to present the story as it happens. If he's going, "This dude sucks, fuck this dude," you don't read the book. It's the work of the book is how do you get someone to read from start to finish about an unlikable person and capture attention along the way. And like, it's funny with my stuff on ancient philosophy, people go, "Oh, this is just self-help." And I go, yes, that's the point. Like, if writing about ancient philosophy was enough to get people to read ancient philosophy, I wouldn't have to do it. Like, the ancient philosophers did ancient philosophy. The problem is we now exist in a world where the vast majority of people can't read ancient philosophy or have no interest in ancient philosophy. So by taking self-help, which people pick up when they walk through the airport or somebody buys for someone who's going through something, and I use it as an entry point into ancient philosophy, I'm doing precisely that kind of jiu-jitsu. And people don't like that because they want to speak only to people like them, which is this sort of 1% sliver who really likes the original stuff or could take the full factual breakdown. And that's not where most people are. And that's not where opinions are changed and worlds are opened up. It's much more like if you just wrote a book about Richard Nixon, for instance, and corrupt politics in the middle of the 20th century, that's going to sell less copies than doing that through a lens of Hunter S. Thompson, who has a different reputation, right? And so that the art of it is they think you're doing one thing and really you're doing another thing. And that's what the ancients were doing too.
Yeah. And I don't know why we don't think that to make art, they were dealing with the same wagers and stakes, when at every move, even more so than we are. And, and had to, not just like that idea of, getting the reader to do work, or that metaphor of jiu-jitsu, you're exactly right. But that, if they made one more mention than they did, their lives are over.
Yes.
That they're no longer. And we've talked a lot in the 20th and 21st century about this in a kind of global way. But it always blows my mind that the historical conversation, or when we talk about it in the historical sense, that gets left off too.
Well, yeah, it's like there's two forms of death. One, like you are too on the nose and the emperor cuts off your head. The other, you're too on the nose, you're too lectury, you're too boring, you're too factual, and the reader cuts off your head because they say, "I don't want to read this anymore." And you think Plutarch is going, you think you want to read about Alexander the Great because you think he's a hero. Let me present to you why he was great in many ways, but ultimately a tragic case. And maybe you totally missed the point. You're Napoleon, you read it and you're like, fuck, I love Alexander the Great. But if you're somebody who can be persuaded, you're seeing the more nuanced picture. This is why he writes parallel lives. Yeah. So it's Cato and Caesar, how they're contrasting with each other, right? Exactly. And he's comparing them without saying who's better, but it's obvious who's better, right? And the artfulness of having to persuade the audience, who will kill you if you're boring, and then speak truth to power without threatening truth to power. This is also, Machiavelli is the most tragic example of this. Machiavelli is writing a book to the people who tortured him. Yeah. Like, Machiavellian is a Republican in the sense that he did not think there should be a prince. And he's having to write about how princes get power. As a historian, he's writing about this. And he's having to find a way to both say, this is how it works, but also this probably isn't how it should work, without tipping off the people who have already tied him to the rack and spun him around, And that the subtlety to which he's doing it. And then today we're like, oh, that's very Machiavellian. Like, dude, this dude was threading a fucking needle with his life on the line, and you're missing the way that this can both be read from both perspectives and has this kind of dual lesson in it. And I think Hunter S. Thompson is doing that in his own way. It's fun and ridiculous and excess. And it's also this profound sadness and indictment ultimately of the same culture. It's just the tragedy of he gets hooked on the stuff.
Yeah.
And he can't get out.
His son wrote a great book called Stories I Tell Myself, Juan Thompson. And so I tried to end with Nixon leaving, but those years after are really tough because it's the way we understand alcoholism now, coupled with how Thompson would take dexedrine.
Yeah.
There was a price to be paid later. And his son writes about getting hooked on the stuff. I mean, he was drinking a 750 milliliter bottle of Jack Daniels every day, starting when he woke up. And it just dissolved him from the inside out, and his mind too.
Yeah.
And so you're right. Like he is seen in this kind of extreme way, and he would present himself that way. But eventually he became the caricature he would promote, and that happened later. And it wasn't through tons of acid or drug, which are, whatever, but it was just through alcoholism, and it was eventually, speed and cocaine and all these different things, but he was just dissolving his body with that. And I think that gets lost. And I think one of the hardest questions is, how much do you internalize in both your writing and your sensitivity, the tumult around you?
Yeah.
Think of Didion, having her panic attacks and, passing out and going into a psychiatric treatment facility in the summer of 1968. And her great line is, in retrospect, I don't think nausea, or, bouts of dizziness were entirely the wrong reaction to the summer of 1968. And the same with Thompson, how much do you internalize that tumult and danger around you? And what's the line where then that becomes too much and you're not been able to express your perspective on it because of your proximity or sensitivity to it?
Yeah, the toxicity of the people he's around, he absorbs it and doesn't have a mechanism for filtering it and processing it. And he kind of turns against himself.
Yeah, and he just he burned very brightly. I mean, James Salter's a fascinating comparison because Salter wrote until he was 85, 86, 90, was still writing his next book when he passed away. And Thompson, from what I've seen, there were still brilliant pieces later, never really wrote in the same way as he did when he was younger and healthier.
No, there's a F. Scott Fitzgeraldness to it.
Yeah.
I think with Dorothy Parker looked at his corpse and just said, "You poor son of a bitch," and that's Hunter S. Thompson.
That is, except there's a kind of terrifying sense of doom that imagine if Fitzgerald lived those next 30 years with that kind of...
But as a shell of a person,
yes.
like he didn't successfully kill himself earlier, which is what Fitzgerald did.
Yes. With alcohol. Yeah, exactly right. And I think art doesn't have to be seen as self-destructive.
Yeah.
But to think that somehow, and again, this goes back to baseball, I would think of Barry Bonds, a player I enjoyed watching growing up, and he was very difficult with the media. He was very guarded. To think that his success, his incredible ability, and then also love the issues with steroids, to think that his uniqueness is somehow separate from his personality and who he is mind-blowing. And the way we often separate writers from their work. I mean, it's been a conversation that's going on a long time. I think it's just another form of reduction that we have now. And Thompson he wasn't a good writer because he was an alcoholic, but there was a terrible, terrible wager going on that he didn't even know what side he was coming down on, and I there's no one right answer to it. I find it to be, that it gets back to that, I quoted it earlier, but that line from Conrad, it's like, life is short and art is long and success is really far off. That's not a good thing.
No.
That's not heartening. It's like, my book will eventually be written. It's like, no, there are a lot of things that could go wrong at any moment. And how could somebody's athletic brilliance be separate from the way they see the world? And especially the wager Barry Bonds made. Then
of course they're going to do anything it takes to be able to express that.
Yeah.
It's like almost a form of body dysmorphia, where it's like, I have this thing that has to get out. The world has to see me the way I see myself. Yeah. And I'll turn myself into whatever kind of art monster I have to be able to do it.
Or a steroid monster.
Yeah. Right.
It's and then there's the moral argument too, where it's like, Mark McGuire wasn't a better hitter than Barry Bonds, but on steroids, he was succeeding more. Why should that person be able to do it when I'm the one who has more talent and I'm not rising, going up to that level?
Well, this was awesome. I love the book, and thanks so much for doing this.
I've really enjoyed talking.